Good afternoon and very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Golden, the University Professor of Globalization and Development. I used to be the director of the Oxford Martin School, but now I'm the director of the Oxford Martin Program on Technological and Economic Change. It's a huge pleasure to be able to welcome back for the third time Jeff Sachs to the school. Jeff has been a thought leader in development and in macroeconomic policy around the world for many, many years. But in addition to being a thought leader, Jeff brings to this a real connectivity to policy which is so often lacking in economics and in academia in general. He really does have an impact on the way the world works, and an impact which is driven by deep passion for ordinary people and for development. And it's for that reason he is a person I regard as an absolute model in academia, someone who's able to bring these things together. And of course, a model for the Oxford Martin School and the sort of work we do in bringing academics together with policy and impact. I first met Jeff when he was the director of the Harvard Institute for International Development, and I was economic advisor to President Mandela because Jeff became very involved in South Africa and helped us think about that transformation. As he has done, I think it's over 100 countries around the world in very deep ways. He went on from Harvard to becoming the director of the Earth Institute, and I'm pleased to say that one of our advisory board members, Alex Halliday, is replacing him as the director of the Earth Institute, which is a remarkable institution at Columbia University, very much sharing things in common with the Oxford Martin School, interdisciplinary, focused on dealing with great challenges, particularly in the planetary space, in health spaces and other spaces, bringing academics, over 850 of them together across from the whole of Columbia. While doing that, he was advisor to many, many organizations, and not least to the United Nations Secretary General, where he was absolutely in the kitchen in the design of the Millennium Development Goals, and then the Sustainable Development Goals, first with Kofi Annan, and then with Ban Ki-moon, and more recently with Guterres, the current Secretary General. Jeff is able to think strategically and to be able to bring that strategic insight, which draws on academic best practice into these extraordinarily complex institutions like the UN, and make very succinct goals on it. He's a recipient of many, many prizes. I won't list them all. And of course, a prolific author of many, many great books. Amongst the books that he has written is The End of Poverty, which I commend to you, really making the case that we can make poverty history, not only in the rich world, of course, which he is passionately engaged in the politics of the US and elsewhere, but most importantly, around the world. Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet, a thought leader on climate change, on environmental sustainability and other areas, The Price of Civilization, and I think it's your most recent book, unless you brought another one out since I read this, Building the New American Economy, Smart, Fair, and Sustainable. It's with huge pleasure, Jeff, that we invite you to speak to us today on a topic which is different to many of those that you've worked on in the past, but which is very much at the center of the program that I'm working on economic and technological change, thinking about how this technological change, and particularly how artificial intelligence, will impact on development and distribution going forward. Jeff, we're delighted to have you here.
Ian, thank you, and it's wonderful to be here, and to also thank you for your leadership and the leadership of the Oxford Martin School. In general, I believe that if the world is going to find its way out of the various very significant messes that we are in, and believe me, we're in a lot of deep messes, despite all of our knowledge, our technology, our wealth, we're going to need even more active leadership from universities to do it. Our normal politics is not capable, it's not organized around long-term thinking and long-term solutions, and our universities have to step up to play that role. And the Oxford Martin School, by design, is playing a world-leading role in that, and I commend you for getting this institution so dynamically running and leading, and also ask that all of you continue pushing, because Trump will not figure it out on his own, okay? So we have to help with some ideas along the way, and that really is a responsibility for us. The topic that Ian mentioned and that I'm going to be speaking about, and that you have many of the world thought leaders on, is how to understand the advent of a major technological revolution that is at least as big as the huge technological revolutions of the last 200 years that have completely transformed the world. The digital revolution is doing what the steam revolution of James Watt did, what the electrification revolution of Faraday and Edison and Tesla and others did, and other such massive technological changes. It will change how our labor markets work, how our societies function, the geography of economic activity, and therefore really the functioning of our societies. This is a big change. Of course, digital revolution means lots of technologies, and I'll describe in a few minutes what I mean by this. But for that particular variant of writing in recent years, there are a few books by people I very much like, so I don't want to pick on them, but a wonderful and completely wrong book by Robert Gordon on American economic growth, for example, or a book by Tyler Cowen in the same way, or Larry Summers' idea about secular stagnation. The idea that somehow we've exhausted the big technical changes, the low-hanging fruit is gone, and growth is therefore slow for this reason. Are you kidding? We're in the midst of the most dynamic technological changes imaginable, and we're still many decades into this, I would say, seeing an acceleration of what's possible right now. And so there's absolutely no sense that we've run out of either things to do, or that the underlying dynamic of change which has defined the modern economic era, really, I date it to 1776, which is a convenient date because it's the date both of the Wealth of Nations, but also of James Watt's patent on the first really commercially viable steam engine. Since then, we've been in an era of massive change, generation to generation, and we're still in such a change. And it behooves each generation to understand the nature of the technologies that are the movers of change, and to be able to characterize them, understand their deeper functioning, and to conceptualize how they might alter the world in the future. Strangely, economics, which is the most materialist of the social sciences, has not done a good job traditionally of mapping from technological change to change of social and economic organization. In fact, ask an economist and he or she will tell you there are N technologies. Don't ask me to name them, but I'll give you the index number. and don't ask me to understand any of their particular properties except that maybe they raise productivity or they are a coefficient or a parameter in front of a production function. So neoclassical economics has not really ever carefully modeled the nature of technology and its implications for change within the economy itself, except retrospectively. Historians have looked back and asked, what did the railroad mean? What did canals mean? What did electrification mean? But we've rarely done that in real time. And I think the work program underway here, and should be more broadly, on what AI, for example, means for the economy is an unusual exercise and a very important one, and not one where you can go to the mainstream of economics methods with our flexible functional forms and our lack of detailed knowledge of specifics to find good ways to consider this question. And one of the reasons, by the way, that economists don't learn much about specifics in general is that they don't want to be out of date, because the truth is that if you learn a lot about specifics, whatever you learn will really be out of date. But the implication of that should not be that we just float above the surface, never really understanding very deeply how anything really works, but just trying to keep enough generality that we're never antiquated in real time. Our job is much harder than biologists, after all. They study the cell, and it just remains the same. Not anymore, by the way. Now that there's genetic engineering, it'll look a lot harder for the biological engineers as well. But traditionally, you could pretty much bank on an amoeba looking like an amoeba and the various functional parts of the cell staying where they are. And you could spend your career studying a particular protein, how it folds, its shapes, its receptors, its expression, and so forth. And that's how biology could build up to such depth of knowledge. In economics, we don't do that. We don't have academic experts that study one machine for decades. Of course, you'd lose your job if you did that anyway. But we have a real puzzle, and I'm just phrasing this at the beginning because I can't give you the detailed answers to these questions. Nobody can yet, but I very strongly support this line of work and plan to be engaged with it in the future as well. So this is a really ugly slide, violates all PowerPoint rules. Don't pay attention. I'm just going to use it for some notes for me. Here's the point that I want to summarize. We're experiencing a wave of general purpose technology. The biggest way to think about the wave of general purpose technology is the mobilization of bits, zeros, and ones to store, manipulate, transfer information. And so that digital revolution, the revolution of binary code to use, mobilize information, and now artificial intelligence, is one of the most fundamental general purpose technologies, and it's an invention that is now probably, as I'll date it, about 80 years old, I would say, because modern computation was invented in England in the 1930s and in the United States in the 1940s. With all respect to Babbage and Ada Countess Lovelace. But still, this is about 80 years old, and it is a very powerful profoundly powerful idea that almost everything expressible as information can be digitized and therefore can be handled electronically and therefore can be stored, replicated, transmitted, and now used as a basis of machine learning as well. And it will have absolutely profound transformative effects in every sector of society. One of the things it will do will be to completely upend the labor market. And it will therefore not only change the jobs of the future, and I think on net eliminate vast numbers of jobs, and by on net I mean jobs that will not be replaced by other jobs, because I think we are in a long-term trend of disappearing jobs, which is great, because the converse of that long-term trend is not unemployment, it's leisure, it is recreation, it's retirement, it's lifelong learning, it's many things that are not remunerated work. And so I think that this will accelerate that process of movement from work to other kinds of activities, a point that Keynes already made 87 years ago in his great essay on the economic possibilities for our grandchildren, written in 1930. We can say something intelligent about what such a major technological change will mean, and the reason is we've been seeing this process at work, not with this technology as much, or not with the wave of this technology fully exhausted by any means, but because of what we learned about other great waves of technological change during the modern economic growth era. And the first point is that labor has been substituted by capital since the 1700s, since the steam engine. Of course, you could say even longer perhaps, but I would say that Keynes made the point in the economic possibilities of our grandchildren that if a Roman peasant were brought to the English countryside in 1750, the peasant from 1 AD would feel pretty much at home because not too much would have changed in the technologies that the Roman farmer would see in England in 1750. But then came the breakthrough of modern economic growth. And since that time, we have been on a long-term path of machines, capital substituting for labor. And if you define the terms carefully so that capital includes not only physical capital, natural capital, but also human capital and intellectual capital, so intellectual property and training with formal education, then the substitution of raw labor by other forms of capital is the decisive defining element, I would say, of the period at least since 1850, when you needed to have schooling, first primary numeracy and literacy, then secondary education by the middle of the 20th century, and now higher education, now in effect to keep ahead of the machines. We've had capital labor substitution for 200 years. It has proceeded in a fairly understandable way, which Carl Frey and Michael Osborne embodied in, who are they? Because I don't, yeah, thank you. Okay, we've not met before, but you made the great pivotal article on this, moving from repetitive, predictable work, mechanical work, to more contextual work, more cognitive work. So physical force of a spinning jenny or a power loom was the first kind of substitution to be made at the end of the 19th century. And predictable, repeatable, mechanical, force-bearing action was the jobs that went first. And progressively, the more contextual and the more cognitive jobs are being replaced as the machines get smarter and smarter. So there is a logic of transformation, and it shows up starkly in how the economy has evolved over the last 75 years. It's not a guess about the future, it's a stark reality of the last three-quarter century, as I'll show you in a moment. The digital revolution will continue this process, but it's going to continue it in a new way. The process itself, I think most consequentially, is a highly technical, science-based process. It involves the creation of massive intellectual property. Therefore, the functional distribution of income is going to depend tremendously on how we define intellectual property, which does not have natural definitions. We know that the competitors of patent-based and open source, for example, are just two of the models of how IP can be managed in the future. And so that's going to have a very big effect on income distribution. The idea that I was trained in 46 years ago when I entered the study of economics was that the labor share of value was relatively constant. This was one of Kaldor's stylized facts of economic growth. It was wrong then and wrong now. It was wrong then because, as I'll emphasize, it took a category of the national accounts called compensation and called that all labor income, even though a large part of it is a return to education, not to labor per se. So it was already a statistical illusion at the time that Kaldor called it. But we learned that, and we learned that the reason that the labor share of income is constant is that the aggregate production function is Cobb-Douglas. And that's another bad idea. Clever, you can assign problem sets, you can solve equations, you can put your computers to work, but there is no aggregate production function anyway, and it's not Cobb-Douglas. Income has been shifting functionally away from labor for a century, and it will continue to shift away from labor. And if we categorize the kinds of income more carefully so that we divide what we call labor income into returns to skills, returns to schooling, returns to schooling versus labor, that shift is stark already. If you're a low-educated worker, you don't command many resources in the labor market, and your return has been falling in real terms, which in a Cobb-Douglas world is not quite possible. But now income will shift, I think, even from that broad category of compensation to other categories of income. A big question that is asked is, will there be new jobs to replace the jobs that are lost? This is not a good question in general, because new jobs don't replace jobs that are lost in any arithmetic sense. The whole trend is that we work less. Of course, we define what I'm doing right now as work, for example, which it's not work. Maybe it's work for you watching me. Maybe someone assigned you that you have to come here, or it's painful, or you've had to be paid to be here. I'm here because it's really pleasant. I'm going to have a nice conversation and get a good dinner out of it. But what we call work has changed phenomenally over the last century also, so we even have a very funny definition of work. They pay me to have coffee all day, talk to people, never break a sweat, have a nice time, see wonderful places, and I get paid for that somehow. I think people may resent that fact also, but I would not call it work in the sense of hard physical labor that was characteristic of work for almost everybody on the planet for almost all the time until the last 50 or 100 years, and now is still the real life of half the people in the world who come home exhausted after a very, very hard physical day weeding their farm or carrying things all day or being under an abusive foreman in a toxic factory setting. That's work. That kind of work has been diminishing. It is one of the prime goals of development to make it disappear, actually. We don't want to save coal mining jobs. We want to make sure that everybody has a decent standard of living without having to go down into a dangerous mine shaft, breathe poisonous fumes, die young, and suffer the risks of calamitous mine shaft failure. So we want these jobs to go away. And what we would like is for the jobs to be replaced by meaningful human activity, which includes a lot of leisure time, which includes a lot of study, creative activity, retirement opportunities, and so forth. So it's the wrong question to ask, will new jobs replace the old, or the happy slogan that the Luddites have always said that new jobs will replace, that the jobs will disappear, but it's always happened that new jobs have been created at the same rate as the old jobs have disappeared. That's never been true. It's not even what we want. So we should clarify what we want from the transformations such as this much more clearly. And what we want is quality of life and creative ways to spend time, and not necessarily jobs in the traditional sense. We would really like robots to be able to do all the heavy lifting and all of the dangerous job assignments and all of the difficult, backbreaking work that is really painful. And there's a lot of it in the world. There will be lots of income distributional consequences and threats from all of this, and that is absolutely core for thinking about a major transformation like this. This cannot come quietly, and it will not be a small deal. And the job of society is to redesign its institutions so that everybody is part of the benefits of this. Because...
Sorry, the pause. Literally.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, thank you. Great, thanks. It's actually the job of institutional design to say, now that we have X, what do we do? That was a point that Karl Marx in his way was getting at, and Engels. We have these big factories. It's the satanic mills of England. It's children in there. It's women in there. They're working 14, 16 hours and blighted lives. What do we do? The answer that they gave wasn't a very good answer, but the question that they asked was a perfect question. And it's no joy that mainstream economists, the ones that we hallow the most, didn't pay too much attention often to those questions. They were either dismally saying nothing can be done in the lines of Malthus and Ricardo, or they were saying that everything is fine, as a lot of liberal economics came to say later on. But we have to ask the constructive question, which is, given these technologies, how should we change society? What we did eventually with the satanic mills was we defined working hours. We finally allowed labor unions to be legally organized and not to be beaten up or killed for trying to organize. We had new rights of worker representation. Institutions like co-determination were introduced finally in the social market economy of Germany, and so on. And we should be asking the same questions now. What institutions will we need to make this work? And that's the discussion of universal basic income, for example. That's the constructive idea. It's not, like many things, it's an incredibly simplified distillation of an issue, but it still is the constructive issue to say, what do we do now, given the trends that we're going to see now? So I'm going to talk about a few kinds of policies at the end: training, income redistribution, shared leisure, promotion of human-machine complementarities, the revival of the humanities, not the revival of universal coding, because machines will do the coding, thank you. So we better have people that do the human stuff, and how we govern and tax IP as well. So we don't have too much time, and I've made it through one of 30 slides. Let me just quickly make a few highlights. First, think of the waves of technology, because Kondratiev really was clever in identifying long technological waves. I would identify 5 myself as general purpose technologies: steam, electricity, the internal combustion engine, Ford Taylorism, meaning the assembly line, and the digital revolution. So one is a process innovation, and the other 4 are technological innovations that each one completely transformed society, raising national output, because these are boons to productivity. We may not measure productivity very well, and especially with the digital revolution, huge amounts of the gains are not measured. We walked from the train station to our first meeting in Oxford on Google Maps. The value that we would pay for GPS is enormous. What it has enabled for business models, for human life, for everything else, but it's free. And so it's not measured in the GDP accounts, and there are 100 things like that that could easily be noted. Each one of these transformations has disrupted almost every major sector of the economy. AI will be, and ICTs, digital revolutions, no exception. New kinds of jobs, big shifts of income distribution, and changing human geography, where people live, where certain places on the planet have advantages. Having oil meant nothing before Daimler and Benz. It meant a lot afterwards. Either you were rich or you were invaded by Britain or the US. One of those were basically your choices. Now having sunshine may be the best thing imaginable. Being in the desert really was not good for the last 10,000 years, but it may be great in the solar era. So technological changes change economic geography pretty fundamentally. So one basic point is that the labor share has never really been constant for 2 reasons. One, that I noted, we don't define functional shares of income distribution properly. But second, if you decompose, say, the US economy, which looked to have a fairly constant labor share for a long time, into subsectors, the labor share in goods producing sectors, which is agriculture, mining, construction, and manufacturing, has been falling sharply for decades. So that's the sector where robotics and servo mechanisms on the assembly line have already displaced vast numbers of workers. And we can therefore use it as a kind of model for the rest of the economy. It did not show up in the macro picture, because at the same time that labor was disappearing from manufacturing, high-skilled work was rising in the new professional classes. And so in the aggregate, it looked like there was no shift from labor. But of course, there was a massive shift from lower-skilled labor to high-skilled labor during this period, and a massive change of sectoral employment. And it's striking to compare the labor force in 1900 and 2015 in the United States. 36% of the workers were agricultural workers in 1900. Now it's 1%. Production workers were 24% in 1900. That's basically all non-agricultural goods producing sectors. Now it's just 14%. Where we had a big rise of employment is in two sectors. One is business services, so trade, transport, and administrative services, which rose from 16 to 28%, and professional class. The professional classes are health, education, and professional services, which is where our R&D comes from to a large extent, for example. And there was no professional class in the US in 1900. It was only 4% of workers. Now it's 39% of workers. We're part of that sector, and very happy part of that sector. Pay is good, quality of life is good, coffee is good, we're doing interesting things, and but if you're in the other sectors, it's been quite different. And the sector that is most likely to go next is the trade, transport, and administrative sector, where there is still 40 to 50 million workers, maybe 20 million in the retail sector in the United States, and we don't need shops. And Jeff Bezos is out to prove it. And this will be a massive displacement of the remaining part of the economy where you get pretty good pay for a high school or some college degree. But those jobs are going to disappear in large numbers soon. And it's already happening. All of our big retail chains are going bankrupt right now because you buy it on Amazon with one click. And if you use a shop, I use a shop to take a picture, go home, and order it on Amazon, typically. And should I not say that? I don't know. I like shops. They're fun to walk through. But I like the things delivered to my flat instead. And we're going to, because AI and matching and all the rest makes it possible to eliminate this intermediate step. It's much more efficient this other way. So we're going to have a big change. So these changes have been underway for a long time. It's basically, I think, I call it an 80-year transformation from Turing, who really started all of this in 1936, to AGI, which is, I think, soon going to be with us. I'm on the optimistic side of that debate, but if it's not AGI, AI is already pervasively with us. And DeepMind is doing miracles every month, and has a long ramp right now for more miracles per month. So what's happening now? What will change with this new dispensation? First, I think we're now really seeing even that balancing where lower skilled workers are losing and higher skilled workers are gaining is now reaching a point where a significant part of the functional distribution of income is going to IP and is going to the corporate sector, the operating surplus of the corporate sector, rather than to the compensation of workers. So it's a big debate, but of course we know that the labor share is now declining even as conventionally measured. This is the US. The decline is about 7 or 8 percentage points. So it's not, this picture exaggerates it by the scaling. But the point is that we're now seeing macroeconomically something even beyond the skilled, low skill transformation taking place. And again, where we see it most dramatically is, in this sector, where the auto sector, because of the assembly line, was able to automate earliest because the assembly line was already a kind of automation. It was turning workers into machines, and now you might as well replace them by machines. They were already doing a machine process, but now the robot can do that process. And the income share of labor in American vehicle production, motor vehicle production, has declined from 70% in 1988 to 42% in 2015. That's a big change. And that helped elect Donald Trump, who is a fool to begin with, and who ran on the promise that he's going to bring jobs home, which don't exist anymore, but he's somehow going to bring them home from Mexico and China. And it's just completely naive. It's a complete misunderstanding of what's going on, but it's not unusual for him. He understands nothing. But he did understand how to get elected president, which I don't understand how he did that. But in any event, this is a structural change from technology. This is not Americans being swindled by Mexicans and Chinese. So the whole model is strange. There's a little bit of that going on, but it's not the dominant force. And if you divide the labor force share of earnings by education level, the top line is low skilled, which is up to some college. And the medium is a bachelor's degree, and the gray line is an advanced degree, MBA or master's or PhD. You can see what's happening profoundly from 1975 onward. And what's happening is very, very clever people are making very, very clever machines to put less educated people out of work. That's how the economy works. And that's what market incentives lead to right now. And we need an answer to that. It's not bad that that's happening if there is compensatory action alongside it, because what's happening is a net gain in total productivity for society without question. These are major advances in being able to do things better. But it's being able to do things better without remunerative, low-skilled work. And this poses huge questions, huge implications for the income distribution, which are not taken up right now. And if you are a libertarian, as the people in Silicon Valley putting the other people out of work are libertarians, the answer is do nothing. But I would tell them, don't expect your equity to be so secure in such a world. You're not going to end up walking away with your billions that way, because this is such a large societal change that we need a different kind of social contract to deal with this, and we don't have it yet. So you could do the same with the share of employment by education. And my point of all of this is to say, to understand the future of AI, we have already about 40 years of data that's not about AI per se, but is about automation that's already deeply underway and having very deep effects that have been understudied. They are studied by labor economists, of course, the labor market bias towards skills, but not deeply studied in terms of which technologies, which processes, which restructuring of sectors have led to these macroscopic changes. We need to redo the national accounts so that we can understand better what's going on. And this is what you're looking at now are not real data. This is made up data, but it's my guess of the data, which is divide the labor compensation by human capital and raw labor, physical labor. And by that, you have to also draw a line. I mean, say 6 years of schooling or less, or maybe 8 years of schooling or less, which is already a lot of investment in human capital compared to past history. In 1900, you'd see 66, 70% of the national income going to labor, or let's say even 3/4 in the US. But in truth, maybe 20% was human capital, and 55% was raw labor, and 25% was returns to capital of some kind, land rents or reproducible capital. By 2017, if you look at the actual data, compensation of labor is still, now it's a little bit lower. Instead of 75%, it may be 60%, or as I just showed you, 57% in the most recent data. But what's happened is that most of that compensation is now returns to skills. But we don't count it that way. So the returns to raw labor, the gray, has collapsed as a share. And the real earnings of lower skilled workers have been falling for 45 years, which is amazing because the economy has doubled and doubled again in the United States. Incomes have soared, but not of high school graduates or less. So that by itself should tell us something. In the future, I think the income distribution will look something more like this, that business capital in some way will have the lion's share of national income, and what we call today labor income will be maybe 30 or 35%, and probably 2/3 of that, 25 of the 35% will be the returns to human capital, and a small sliver will be the returns to raw labor. Now, finally, what will happen to the way we live? Ideally, something like this. I tried to calculate roughly because the data do not exist and I haven't had the time or a student interested yet in doing a really detailed study. What's happened to how we spend our time? The US does a time use survey every year, which is very detailed and very interesting. And in the US in 2015, the average adult, 16 and over, on any given day, including the weekends, was averaging 3 hours and 0.18 of an hour, so 12 minutes, 3 hours, 12 minutes of work. So average work time was 3 hours, 12 minutes. It's pretty good to have a $60,000 per person economy where the average work time is a little over 3 hours. What are other people doing? Well, they have weekends, they have vacation time, they have retirement, they have schooling. So there's a lot of part-time and schooling. And we went, by my estimate, from 7.8 hours a day for 16 and over, almost 8 hours a day of hard physical work, to about 3 hours a day of hard physical work. And by 2050 or 2075, maybe it's 1 hour a day or 2 hours a day. And that would be nice because we'd be a lot richer. We could use our time in other ways. But of course, it raises a fundamental issue. And the fundamental issue is what are the distributional consequences of this? And there are utopian and dystopian visions of this. The dystopian vision is very clear. The dystopian vision is that all the jobs go away. Almost everybody is unemployed or becomes slaves for the robots or for the one company that owns all the robots. Or maybe there will be 5 of them. And there seems to be some trend in that direction, that a few companies, because of network externalities, become absolutely dominant because data is the oil of the 21st century, that data passes through a few portals, of course, and therefore becomes a self-feeding, increasing returns to scale proposition. and a natural monopoly. So it's arguable that a Facebook or a Google or an Amazon could be a natural monopoly. And if we choose not to regulate it as a natural monopoly, and there are reasons why we might not, the dystopian view could be the future. The utopian view is we don't have to work anymore, but we still come to the lectures or some of them because they're interesting, and we are able to live better than before, and we have everything we want because the age of scarcity has actually been ended, and that is also feasible. If you try to model this question, which is very interesting, both of these are completely feasible pathways. And that, I think, is, there's nothing in economics against the dystopian vision. There's nothing naive about the dystopian vision. So the kind of model that I've been playing with, the baby model to try to understand this, is an overlapping generations model. And it's a model in which there are two kinds of capital: the really smart robots that are substitutes for labor, and other kinds of capital like buildings, which are complementary to labor and robots. So you still need shelter like this, and that's complementary to what we do or what the robots do. And investors maximize their returns, and the robots get better. And that's the question I'm asking. What happens when the robots get better at what they're doing? Unambiguously, that is potentially Pareto improving across all people and all future generations, because you're more productive. And the first rule of economics is if society can produce more and you can costlessly redistribute income between people and over time, then of course everyone can be made better off. And I think that's the right way to think about these technologies, as the baseline that they're great. God, they can do amazing things. So in principle, everyone should be better off. But it's very easy to make a setting in which everybody is made worse off, except for a tiny group. So the first thought experiment is let robots become more productive, and older people own the capital of the companies that own the robots, that deploy the robots, so they get all the rent of the robot incomes. Young people come into the world and only have labor to sell, but no one wants labor anymore. So the marginal product of labor has collapsed because the robots plus labor, that's how the production function is defined, as pure substitutes, now means more effective labor, less demand for flesh labor in the flesh, and therefore a falling marginal productivity of workers. And so young people face immiserizing wages. And in an overlapping generations variant, simplest variant number one, rich people see a booming stock market, they're rich, and in such a model, rich people live a great second period, old age. They spend their money, they have a boom, but young people come into the world not being able to sell their labor. And so they end up saving little also because they don't have much labor income. And their children are impoverished, and their children are impoverished. And it's perfectly fine equilibrium. It's not inefficient. It's a fine equilibrium for one generation, the old of the period in which the robots blossom, to become super rich. They buy 300-foot yachts. They have a great time, and all future generations are made worse off. That's not an inefficient outcome. That is the dystopian equilibrium, perfectly sound equilibrium. And the reason it's not inefficient is that you cannot make any other generation better off without taxing the windfall of the older generation. Now, it's easy to make all generations better off. And simply what you have to do is reverse Social Security, which is that the robots are better off, the shares of Amazon, Apple, Google, and everything soars, All the equity owners are rich. You tax them, transfer the money to the young, because, and you know that both the old and the young can be made better off because the pie is larger by definition. You're more productive. So it's perfectly possible to make the young whole, not in their wages, but in their wages plus transfers. And then by having an old to young transfer in all future generations in a balanced budget, every generation is enriched in the future by this. So think of how easy it is to move from dystopia to utopia. Now, another variant is that you could imagine two kinds of households: rich households and poor households. Rich households leave bequests. Poor households struggle and don't leave bequests. The rich household is made richer because they're the equity owners, and they, without government, just leave their kids some of that windfall in inter vivos transfers, in free tuition for college, and whatever it is. Whereas the poor households are just like the story I told at the beginning. The parents don't even have a windfall because they don't have capital, and the kids are impoverished because they can't find a job. And so in that case, you get one part of the society saying, "Are you kidding? This is the best thing that ever happened to us." And you get the other part of society voting for Donald Trump as if he's going to help them, which he's not. But that was the idea of their vote. And so then you get a widening of the intragenerational inequality, as well as future generations of today's rich households doing better off, and today's poorer households suffering absolute declines from this transformation. So all of this is to say, what happens with this revolution depends on social organization. What will happen with market dynamics is not necessarily very kind. It's possible, by the way, that Kaldor's idea could be right, that all workers will be benefited. That's not theoretically impossible. I just would argue it's not likely. It's not likely because not everyone's going to end up in college. It's still the case in the United States that more than 60% of our young people do not get a bachelor's degree, even till today. We're going to have returns to skills, or some people, college is just not going to work. And college might not be enough to resist this wave anyway when the next wave hits the professional workers after it hits the retail workers. So in the end, this is going to be a big, tumultuous change, and we have to get our heads on straight to handle this socially, not just in market terms. And I will end as all such essays, as all such talks end with the best essay on this topic from 87 years ago, The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, which, if you haven't read it recently, you should read it. And if you have read it recently, you should read it again, because it's so much fun. And Keynes writes better than any of us could dream of writing. But I will just end with this. He says, the pace at which we can reach our destination of economic bliss will be governed by four things: our power to control population, our determination to avoid wars and civil dissension, our willingness to entrust to science the direction of those matters which are properly the concern of science, and the rate of accumulation is fixed by the margin between our production and our consumption, of which the last will easily look after itself given the first three. Meanwhile, there will be no harm in making mild preparations for our destiny, in encouraging and in experimenting in the arts of life as well as the activities of purpose. But chiefly, do not let us overestimate the importance of the economic problem of scarcity, or sacrifice to its supposed necessities other matters of greater or more permanent significance. It should be a matter for specialists like dentistry. If economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, that would be splendid. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for not only bringing out what we always know is in you, which is this extraordinary depth of economic insight and going back to Keynes, but also thinking about the long-term future. We had a discussion earlier about the over-concern with the short term and the need to do that. And you've demonstrated that in really vivid ways in this area, which is of deep concern, I think, to everyone, or at least should be. We're going to have a very brief conversation, and then we're going to open this up for discussion. So, Jeff, one thing that you've always worked on, but you didn't talk about much today, is development and the implications of this, particularly for developing countries. In the work that we've done, Carl and Michael have done, we are concerned that a larger share of jobs, and probably more rapidly in developing countries, could be vulnerable to machine intelligence and AI. Anything that's repetitive, rules-based, that doesn't require dexterity or empathy could be vulnerable. And yet we also know those countries are probably less able to deal with this challenge. So are you concerned that the middle rungs of the development ladder might be being removed? And if so, you've always advised developing countries. What would you say to a developing country?
Yeah, I think the rungs that could be lost quickly are even the bottom rungs. Traditionally, for non-resource-based developing countries, the stepping stone or the ladder of development started with textiles and apparel. And the prototypical case right now is Bangladesh, with a cutting and sewing sector of about 2 million people, I believe, at this point. And those jobs will go away. Even a year ago, they said, no, that kind of job will stay, but now robots are being introduced into cutting and stitching. And why not, by the way? Because the orders come with the CAD/CAM production instructions, so you can send the orders and the machines can understand the orders a lot better than making cartoons and cutting out the fabrics and the hand-based activities. So I think we're going to lose most of the labor-intensive sector, and I think agriculture is going to be mechanized very dramatically, and that's where a huge proportion of very poor people live right now and work right now. So I think there is a certain kind of drama that the traditional development model is no more. On the other hand, there is phenomenal opportunity of these technologies themselves, and they offer a path for certain sectors that were unimaginable 5 or 10 years ago. You don't need bank branches anymore. Almost for anything, by the way. I don't know why Manhattan is nothing but bank branches on every street, but it's more an advertising gimmick than it is a real service. And it's a waste of our real estate, but the shops are going away, so banks are filling them in, I think, like billboards, rather than need. But in developing countries, we're just going to have e-payments. We probably won't even have currency in 20 years from now. And this is already happening, of course, throughout Africa, where e-wallets, M-Pesa, and other technologies and micro-saving and so forth on the phone is commonplace, even more commonplace than Manhattan, I would say. So that's an example of a sector that could benefit. Health and education could be incredibly empowered by these technologies. We will have a fundamental change in the need for doctors because doctors are very smart systems, but so are AI systems. And so all of the imaging will be done remotely, or by machine, not even remotely, maybe on the phone. Blood gases, other things will be done by sensors and phone-based or tablet-based interventions. Classrooms should be transformed because we can provide for free, zero marginal cost basically, not zero cost, unfortunately, but near zero marginal cost, access to the world's information if we care to do it. As a Columbia University professor, I have access in a moment to, I don't know, 50,000 journals or something. A student in an African university maybe to zero right now. It's only a password difference, of course, and an organizational business model difference to make the library of knowledge universally available. We need to sort out the IP, maybe segment the markets, do other things, but we could make information freely available. AI is going to mean that you take a curriculum and you can turn it into a local language almost seamlessly within a very short period of time. I think that that will be a huge plus as well. So the question is, what will the developing countries not be able to do? And the real question is, how will they earn their way for the things they need to import? And the question is, what will they need to import? If it's smart systems, those have a zero marginal cost. So one could imagine a new kind of development aid that basically freely licenses many, many core technologies, and development aid becomes basically open source or licensed software or AI systems. If it's hardware, that's where the problem comes in, where you have a real cost, and how do you pay for the roads, the electricity, and the houses needed for urbanization in Africa, for example. If you happen to be sitting on diamond mines and gold mines, that's not a big problem necessarily. But if you don't, you have to figure out some other business model. If you're the Sahel, my recommendation is team up with China and sell desert sunshine to the rest of the world, because China's got wonderful high voltage, direct current, long distance, low loss power transmission, and from Senegal to Sudan, we could make enough energy for 100 Earths, and that would be a good market to develop. So we need to be creative and understand that some of the opportunities are incredibly positive. Total leapfrog. Also, dematerialization, 3D manufacturing vastly simplifies the ability to manufacture in difficult places, because you don't need much except the crude material base necessarily, and the rest is then easily manageable. But the balance of payments constraint, meaning how do you pay for the things you do need from abroad, since you're not going to pay for it through your labor exports in apparel or in mining or even in agriculture. Will you pay for it in resources, in natural capital, in remittance income, because there are no jobs left there, but there may be personal service jobs left someplace else to do? Or will you have the dystopian path that you just can't find the way out? And we've not really worked out any of this yet.
Yeah, a major research agenda. Given that we only have 15 minutes, I'm going to stop the conversation and move to Q&A. This is being webcast live. It is being recorded, so don't say anything if you don't want to be recorded, and do give your name and wait for the microphone to come to you before you speak. Let's see a show of hands and how we're going to do this in 15 minutes. All right. The Cameron, then the woman over there.
Thanks. Cameron Hepburn from the Oxford Martin School. Thanks, Jeff. Great lecture. I liked the idea that between the dystopia and the utopia of your nice model, it was just an easy step. And there was a lot of politics in that easy step. And I noted, I love Keynes's essay, but I was noting as you read it out that actually he's missing that bit too. You touched on it in your lecture, but I'd like you to touch on it a bit more, because whether the robots capture the political system, or at least capital captures the political system, and maybe we do need to understand Trump to shift from dystopia to utopia.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to collect a couple of questions.
Sounds good.
If that's all right. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name's Sophia Swith and I'm an independent consultant. And actually my point was very, very similar, but perhaps more eloquently put by Cameron. I was picking up on your aside, really, that you claim not to know how Trump got elected, when in fact, obviously, recent revelations are giving us quite an insight into that. And I'd be really interested along the same lines of thinking about the politics and the governance of how do we govern AI in a time when the use and abuse of AI is jeopardizing our very models of governance. And following on from that, how do we, or who is going to steer us towards utopia when the multilateral cooperation for regulation is looking at best unhopeful, and when the prospects for self-regulation are looking quite unfeasible? Thank you.
Thanks. And the final question in this round here. Be quick and we'll get another round of it. Yeah, Eric.
Eric Beinhocker, the Oxford Martin School and Blavatnik School. Jeff, you talked about transfers as one key tool. What other experiments should we be running in how to address this? The Industrial Revolution saw big innovations, not just in policies, but institutional structures like universal education, labor unions, but also cultural norms and behaviors, like the idea of a working week or the idea of retirement and vacation. Those were industrial era inventions. So between policies, institutions, and culture, what do we need to do?
Good.
And all of that in 5 minutes if we're going to have another round.
Right. Yeah. So I think there are two kinds of issues. One is the narrow economics issue of these technologies roiling the earning structure in ways that I've described. And we should enrich this, obviously, in a lot of ways, but I've argued that basically technological advance has disempowered lower skilled workers and given a rent to higher skilled workers. And I think that trend will intensify. And I should quickly add that it is also logically possible that everybody benefits, even if the income distribution widens, because the lower skilled workers can be on net improved by this technology also. So everything is parameter values in the sense that it all depends, but the dystopian idea is not a wrong idea per se. Then there's the broader set of issues of governance of this technology in a different sense, in the Cambridge Analytica sense. And thank God it's not Oxford Analytica. It never would be. But how do we really govern intrusions of privacy, all of the huge distortions that come from this surveillance and so on. Also the militarization of this technology, which is already underway and is going to give us a new round of very, very dangerous arms race, which is really almost the only subtext of the U.S.-China business right now. This is all a technology battle. This has nothing to do with our bilateral trade deficit. This is the mindset of the American security establishment. What are we going to do now that China's targeting all these advanced technologies and catching even or moving ahead? And so that's a geopolitical and structural question as well. On the economic side, I do think that the sharing is the right idea, but sharing can mean lots of different tools. So one is direct income redistribution, UWI, and so forth. Another kind of sharing is very simple, and that is everybody is guaranteed a certain set of benefits or access to a certain set of services. That's the social democratic model. I'm a social democrat by ideological persuasion. I think the countries that do all of this best are the Scandinavian countries, though this is straining them as well. But I think they have the right idea. Everybody gets a lot of vacation time. Everybody gets parental leave when they're parents. Everybody gets free education. Everybody gets free health care. So all gains are socialized through the tax system, not through redistribution per se, but through a universal provision of services. I think it's just crazy we don't do that. We're so rich, so affluent. How can we not be doing that, including at a global scale? There should be universal guarantee for everybody to have access to health care, education. And that's what the Sustainable Development Goals say, by the way. That's what they, but of course, try to talk to a policymaker in a rich country about the implications of that for a poor country. And these days, you basically get the door slammed in your face, which is regrettable, but that's what we should be doing. The US does not give 1 day of guarantee of paid vacation. It does not give 1 day of guarantee of maternity leave. It doesn't give 1 day of guarantee of sick pay. You can negotiate it perhaps if you're not in the gig economy and you have some market power. But it's also the case that it was the purpose of the right since Ronald Reagan to break the union movement. That's not only technological, because some countries have maintained a strong union movement. This was directly political to bust the union sector in the United States, which in the private sector is about 9% of the labor force now. It's unbelievable. We have no unions left in the US, almost no unions, and the few that are more predominantly public sector unions. So the social democratic model, which is under strain but not broken by any means, has strong unions, universal benefits, high taxation, and some direct subsidy for work, active labor market policies, and so on. I think that that's probably a sufficient package, actually, if you keep your eye on the income distribution and the bottom line, if you look at the changing wealth distribution and you say, stock market boom, that does not mean corporate tax cuts, that means corporate tax increase, thank you. They got the sign wrong. Right idea, wrong sign. We would actually be able to handle the direct distributional consequences. It's not an accident that it goes the other way, because we also privatized our political system in the United States. We legalized and formalized that you give a lot of money to a candidate and then the candidate does what you ask them to do. Some countries call that the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act, but in the United States it's called corporate free speech, because this is what the Supreme Court, in its idiocy, allowed over the last couple of decades. And so we legalized a system in which corporate power dominates. In the end, one or the other will give. Either democracy will end, or these exorbitant distributions to the rich will end, because we got a lot more votes than they do. And in the end, this will be sorted if democracy stays. It's very fragile right now in the US. I would not guarantee it by any means. But if democracy holds, in the end, we will have redistribution, because it becomes eventually intolerable when private wealth exceeds $100 billion. And then look at Amazon right now. What is it doing? It is getting cities to offer more tax cuts for a second headquarters, and it's fighting like hell against a little homeless tax levy for Seattle itself. This is gross behavior. We have to call, I buy something from Amazon every day, but I don't like the behavior. And we have to distinguish between the service provided and the disgusting behavior of the company. As a company, they have no right to demand more concessions from cities that can barely pay their way, and then to fight when they're the richest company imaginable and on the way to $1 trillion market cap, to fight against measures on homelessness, rather than for Bezos to stand up and say, we'll take care of it. This is our home base. This has made us rich. This has made us comfortable. We love this city. We'll help solve this problem. That's what he should be saying. But we live in such a strange society that they're fighting it tooth and nail, even any constructive approach right now. So democracy is going to go away, or this corporate abuse will go away. We're not in an equilibrium by any means at all. And this relates to the governance of this technology as well. I don't know about you, I've tried hard. I don't understand what these companies do. And every day, it's a new surprise for me. I don't really understand what they're doing with my data. I don't really understand what their business model is. Maybe it's less confusing than or less complex than I'm elaborating, and maybe they really just are selling advertising. But somehow I think it's something more than that. And this, of course, GDPR is an important step forward of Europe saying, and you can say it because they're not your companies, and that's good. You should say it. And you should tax them also, by the way. Really tax them. Because they're earning a lot of income, and it doesn't all have to go to the Cayman Islands or Bermuda or elsewhere. And so this is part of what also should be done. But exactly, I think that these questions of privacy, portability, protections from surveillance, protections from militarization, boy, it's a big agenda, and I feel on my own in answering that, I don't understand enough about the technologies to give clear answers to how to do what needs to be done. I love the technologies, as you heard. I think that they are powerful, wonderful, could solve so many purposes, so many problems that we have. Let us all go to the coffee shop and to the beach and to do the things we'd really like to do, raising our kids and taking care of things that I only want to speak on behalf of the technology and its innovators, but I want the companies to have some responsibility. And when they don't, I want to push back on them.
Jeff, thanks so much for not only being incredibly perceptive, but also calling the spades in this company, the abusive practices, and throwing light at power. We don't have time for more, but fortunately, there are hopefully 2 other opportunities to engage with Jeff. I know Charles Godfrey, the director of the school, was sorry not to be here, but we have agreed with Jeff that we're going to invite him back and give him a big lecture. Many people couldn't fit in today, so we're hoping to get the Sheldonian Theatre next time, and hopefully that'll provide a further opportunity for conversation. But also, you are all invited to a reception with Jeff now, and so you can have a chat with him over a drink, which we need after that very sobering conclusion. Do keep an eye on the Oxford Martin School website. There's a huge amount going on here. Tomorrow we have Sarah Harper talking about putting science at the heart of society and culture, an extremely important issue, with Emily Wilson from New Scientist and Catherine Matheson from the British Science Association. And then next Thursday, the 31st, really thinking about the fake news and the reason why science hasn't been able to dominate, or the evidence debate, with Nikki Hawkins, who's going to be talking about stats and studies are not enough, how to gain people's trust in scientific authority. Extremely topical as well. Thanks to you all for coming, and most of all, thanks to Jeff for such an incredibly stimulating and, I found, very, very perceptive presentation. Thanks, Jeff.